Glad to see you.
Yeah, always wonder if you're dead, it's not.
Yeah, I just told her, she said, say hello.
Let me get this. Excuse me for a minute.
You doing okay? Good. So just introduce yourself and
I will.
start.
Hi, good afternoon. I don't know if you can hear me. Is this on all right? My name is Frank Franklin. My parents gave me that very easy name because they figured I'd be stupid. And so I do have a lot of fun with that. If I check into a motel with my wife, they ask me if I'm just going to be there an hour because they don't believe my name is real. I'm a professor emeritus at UAB. Practiced pediatric gastroenterology there since 1990 when I came into town. Last 5 years that I was at UAB, I was chair of a department of of maternal and child health at our School of Public Health. And so I've been on both sides of the fence in terms of practicing medicine, pediatrics that is, for many years, and also public health. I remain active with a lot of different groups in the community interested in public health. Today I'm going to talk about a topic about health disparities, and that is differences in health outcomes by individuals in our community, but it's also true of communities across the country. I'm going to discuss who experiences health disparities, where do they experience them, why do they experience them, and then what can be done. So I've given you my contact information. I'm happy to answer your questions either by phone or by email. Your feedback might be like this, where you say, Frank was like a longhorn cow, a point here and a point there and a lot of bull in between. So I'm going to give you the 2 points so you can relax and enjoy your lunch and then grab and go if you have to. I'm going to talk to you about various levels that influence the experience our patients have in terms of the level of society and government, the environment, which includes the physical environment, the social environment, and the family environment, various emotions. The vast number of people who experience anxiety, depression, fears of various sorts. All of that has an impact on our health behaviors, be they diet, activity, safe sex, etc., all of which can cause disease. At the end, we'll end with talking to you about some policies and public-private partnerships. But if we really want to influence our patients' behaviors, I think it comes down to incentives. I think that we don't use incentives enough. And that is incentives to eat healthier, to forego some of the junk food in the environment, to be more active and less sedentary. And I think the use of incentives are very important and very effective, and they can be done at the level of taxes or any number of different ways. I'm going to give you a brief overview, talk to you about a patient or a prototype patient that I took care of for many years in our obesity clinic. Talk to you about obesity outcomes and the geographic distribution. That place matters, that is where we live, work, and play. The role of education. As a pediatrician, I'm highly committed to education, which influences your health and your wealth. Health outcomes, both nationally in Alabama and here in Jefferson County, and I understand that we have states as far away as Texas and maybe Mississippi and Tennessee on this network today, but what I say about Alabama would be true about those other states as well. Talk about some of the things that determine these health outcomes, how I think we can improve our communication and facilitating behavior. If we want people to do something, it makes it a lot more effective if we make it easier for them to do it. Just like we serve lunch here because people will come for lunch, but also it means we don't have to go to a cafeteria, pick up food, and bring it into a room, etc., and wait in line. It's all out on a buffet. So if it's easy and available, people will do it. And if healthier foods like the chicken breast or whatever is there, then we have some healthier choices, or the salad bar, for instance. Finally, there's a business case for what we're doing. I mean, in medicine, we're always thinking about the bottom line. We have to keep the place afloat. And then strategies for improving these health outcomes, and then we'll take some questions and answers. We face any number of health problems, whether they be obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer. But in fact, if you have a health problem, you really want to grab it just like you would a basketball, essentially, with one hand being classic individual patient care, health care. The other being the population focus of public health. And I think they're really not competitive, they're really cooperative when well done. Essentially, every patient has a health burden that they are pushing along the course of their life. Our job in public health is to lower the height of that fulcrum, and that is by providing good work opportunities, good educational opportunities, healthy environments to live and work. But ultimately it is an individual responsibility, no different than going up to the food here and making your series of choices. What we do is make good things available and maybe not so good things available. When we think about patients, at the patient focus, we think about their adverse behaviors. There's still a lot of people smoking, using drugs, practicing unsafe sex, eating adversely, and being very sedentary. But then the question is, and we can counsel them all we want, and that'll be the message from patients today, but we have to understand that many of our patients are depressed, they're anxious, or they feel isolated. At another level, it's all the environment they're in. It's a matter of the physical environment, the decay, blight, which is so common in so many areas. Areas of crime, lack of safety, and then access to medical care. A lot of patients still don't have access to medical care in our state, here in Alabama, and through a number of southern states. In the larger social environment, many people lack connection to other people, so-called social cohesion. They don't have somebody to turn to for social support. They're unable to trust individuals, trust their neighbors. And they have negative norms, that is what we consider what we should do for good health. On the other hand, we have an enormous number of single-parent households. We have a number of households where there's significant family conflict. And then we have people who are so busy and so anxious that there's a lot of disruptive parenting. At the larger level of society, we see issues of poverty, injustice, and discrimination. So when we think about our patient and we think about their behaviors, we have to be thinking about these other levels. Now, we as practicing physicians may not work at every one of those levels, but we have to think about how we can help patients with issues of facilitating healthy behaviors. I'm going to talk to you about a patient. This patient, Tameka Oates, I saw for 12 years in our obesity clinic at Children's. An African-American female who came in for obesity at age 11. She had a BMI of 42 or 43. All of you recognize that in adults at least, and here she was at age 11, obesity would be defined as a BMI, that is a version of weight for height, of 30. And the BMI we typically use in pediatrics might be the 95th percentile of somebody of the same age and gender, which would have been 23. She was in early stages of puberty, but she had already shown features of the metabolic syndrome in terms of insulin resistance, high triglycerides, and a low level of the HDL cholesterol. Family history of diabetes and obesity. We initiated lifestyle and activity counseling, and we failed. Not unusually. At age 14, she had a BMI of 46. Age 18, a BMI of 51. At age 19, she was pregnant with weight over 300 pounds, gestational diabetes, which of course would progress ultimately in her family history to regular adult onset diabetes. She had adequate prenatal care. She did deliver a healthy newborn, Dewan, as a single child. So this is the percentiles, and I won't bother boring you with that. Her medical history is that she was born about 6 weeks early. Mother did not recall her birth weight. Mother was 17 when Tameka was born. Tameka's dad was in the area but visited rarely, and we felt this was a case, given her grandmother and mother's history of transgenerational obesity and diabetes. So that experience across families is very common. Let's talk about her social history. How many of you know downtown Birmingham? Okay. So she resided in Inslee, going west on I-20 there from downtown with her mother and Dewan. She went to Jackson Olin High School, one of the failing high schools in Birmingham. Left after 10th grade, but she was similar to 47% of the other children there at Jackson Olin who didn't graduate. She plans to complete her GED when Dewan starts Head Start. She's not currently working outside the home, but looking for a job. She feels that taking care of her child is a lot of work. She tires easily and her feet hurt. So let's talk about obesity in our area and statewide. I don't know if you all are old enough to remember when Gilda Radner was on Saturday Night Live playing Rosanna, but she would always say, if it ain't, it's always something. If it ain't one thing, it's another. And so what you can see in this panel on the left is that we've done a very good job over the last 50 or 60 years in prevention and treatment of cardiovascular disease. A lot of the prevention comes from the fact that we're no longer smoking like we did back when I was a medical student and resident. Effective medications for controlling lipid levels, like all the statins that are there, angiotensin receptor blockers, etc., that many people are on for hypertension. So altogether, we've knocked cardiovascular disease down by 50 to 60% and stroke even further. At the same time, though, because of this emerging obesity epidemic over that same period of time, we have a vast increase, probably a 4 or 5-fold increase in the prevalence of diabetes in the population, and as population has grown, an enormous number of diabetics. So that in Alabama and in all the southern states, we know that about 1 out of every 8 adults will have diabetes, and that rate is only going up. There's a distinct association between body weight or body mass index and type 2 diabetes, particularly in women. But essentially, if we had the entire population of normal weight people, we would cut diabetes by about 90% in the population. But you can see when you go out to a BMI of 30 in a woman, you're essentially talking about a 50% increase in risk, and then 100% risk by the time you go out to super obesity, which is a BMI of 35. The prevalence of obesity is increasing all the time over the last 30 or 40 years. We in the South, whether we talk about Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, Tennessee, have very high rates compared to some of the states in the mountain area or all the way out west. So that in Jefferson County, where our hospital is located, we have about 35% of adults who are obese. And if we go into the part of Jefferson County that's in Birmingham City, the rate of obesity is 42%. So very high rates. Where are we going to go? Well, there's recently a projection, which you may have seen on TV or read about, where as trends continue over the next 10 years, so not so far away, 2030, 54% of adults will be obese in Alabama. Similar high rates, in Mississippi it'll be as high as 60%. And similarly in Oklahoma, 60 to 65%. So very high rates of obesity are in the future. So the smartest investment you can make if you were an investor and you wanted to invest in a pharmaceutical firm would be something that was a diabetes drug, because you sure as hell are going to get a lot of use of that over the next over your career if you're a relatively young person. U.S. has a rate of about 1 out of every 11 adults has diabetes. In Alabama, it's about 1 out of every 8, and the same in Jefferson County. So we're blessed with higher rates in this area. But you can see that whole southern tier of states is very high as well. There are distinct relationships between income and obesity, income and diabetes, and income and sedentary behavior. So that you see in counties throughout the U.S., and right here in Jefferson County, we're in a relatively poor county, and many of, I imagine, the hospitals are similarly in poor counties. You see that as you go from wealthy counties to poorer counties, the rate of obesity increases, the rate of diabetes increases, and a lot of that is explained not just by obesity, but our sedentary behaviors. So Tameka Oates, let's go back to our patient. Why did she fail to lose weight? Well, she did not adhere to the diet and activity plan. She did not keep follow-up visits. Her family was not involved and was not particularly supportive. They were unwilling to change their diet. And likely, those of us in clinic who saw her had poor counseling skills. So who can we blame and shame? Lots of times we like to place blame rather than figure out solutions. What did we miss? I think we missed the larger context of Tameka's life, specifically where she lived and where she went to school and where she played. And this is a typical intake form of almost any hospital. In this case, it's from Children's downtown here in Birmingham, where I worked for so many years. So I'd say to people, what data after patient name, age, and chief complaint is the most important information on this form? Now, if you're a healthcare administrator, you're going to say the insurance information. Well, that's not it for me. It's where they live, because that informs on the neighborhood context. That context counts and is critical for patient care. Now, we all hear about precision medicine. And UAB and many medical centers are very big now on genetic diagnosis. It seems to play a role in cancer treatment. But importantly, one person commented, when it comes to health, your zip code matters more than your genetic code. And I think when you're talking about a disease like obesity, which is going to affect 54% of the population in Alabama, you're not talking about a genetic disease. You're talking about clearly an environmental insult, and that's what we're experiencing. Now, where is Inslee? Well, we're out here in sort of northeast Jefferson County, out in Medical Center East. You can see UAB downtown, and then going further east on I-20, through all the construction that's going on now, you see Inslee. Let's talk about distressed communities. You can code out community levels of distress by measures of people who have high school diplomas, housing vacancy, adults not working, poverty rates, change in employment, and change in business establishment. So where are communities dying and distressed? In the deep brown sections there, you can see most of Birmingham. And then right as you go over the mountain, as many of you know, you come into communities like Mountain Brook, Vestavia, Hoover, Pelham, and coming out that way. And there's almost a distinct fence, a border, essentially, that walls off whether you want to call it Red Mountain or whatever, that walls off communities like Inslee from the over-the-mountain communities. And so I've indicated there in the little yellow sort of triangle, that's Inslee, right in the middle of a distressed area. Oops. Okay, what's it like living in Inslee? Well, first of all, almost all of your neighbors are poor. 45% of residents are impoverished. 65% are on public assistance. There are high rates of abandoned structures and vacancy, and so usually that just means the whole neighborhood is dying. And then you have high rates of violent crime. A pretty difficult neighborhood to grow up in. Let's talk about the schools. We have Mountain Brook, which, as you know, is probably one of the wealthiest communities in the country, but similarly, any of our other hospitals would have similar high income areas. And if we look at school proficiency of the students in 11th grade, and we look at level 1 and 2, which means you're not proficient, and 3 and 4 in being proficient, we see a distinct separation between Mountain Brook and Jackson-Olin High School when they're only about 4 miles apart. So that essentially 95% of the students in Mountain Brook are proficient, whereas essentially 90% of the students in Jackson-Olin are not proficient. If we look at math, it's the same way. Essentially, really, like 99% of the students at Jackson-Olin are not proficient, and 85 to 88% of the students in Mountain Brook are proficient. So it goes beyond parents to just opportunities that there are in schools. If we look at a measure of opportunity in communities, in the U.S. in general, and opportunities are areas where young adults have completed an associate degree or more, and there are various measures that are on this and in your handout. Overall, even whites in Alabama have less opportunity than whites nationwide. Blacks similarly have lower opportunities. And if we look at sort of the black-white ratio or percentage, we see that we're doing equally badly by the whites in our states and in our state and by the blacks. And this would be true in almost all southern states. So there's less opportunity for children. Let's talk about the outcome of education. Birmingham City will report high levels of graduation, 79%. It's lower than their magnet school, Ramsey, which is 100%, and it's lower than some of the over-the-mountain communities, which is 93, 95%. However, if you look at the proficiency rates, or you look at something called college and career readiness, which means somebody is ready for a career, and that includes going into the armed services. So these are not medical careers, these are not legal careers, this is not on your way to the Supreme Court or whatever. This is even able to go to the military. You see that only 45% of the students, despite having supposedly graduated, are not college and career ready. Whereas in the over-the-mountain schools, the wealthier school districts, it's about 85 to 95% of the kids are college and career ready. Now there's something going on in our state whereby there's a good relationship between high school graduation and college and career readiness if you're white. So they only differ by about 11%. If you're black in our state, that difference is 31%. So a lot of kids are getting high school diplomas, but they're not college and career ready. So that diploma is fake. It's an opportunity for an Instagram picture or a Facebook posting, but it's not a valuable degree. Let's talk about the number of kids that are thrown away every year in Birmingham. What I'm going to tell you is that every year, Birmingham City has 1,235 students who are destined for poverty and poor health because either they dropped out of high school or they come out of high school without college and career readiness. So we're essentially setting up 1,200 to 1,300 children every year for a life in poverty and poor health. So the schools are failing because we know that education is highly connected to wealth and to health. Let's talk about health outcomes. Won't bore you with all these numbers, but just to say that here in Jefferson County, our longevity in 1990 and in 2010, and I'm sure it'll be true in 2020, is lower than the average. So people in Jefferson County are dying on average about 2 to 3 years earlier than people throughout the U.S. Whereas in Shelby County, they're living longer than the national average. But most important, the longevity is going in the wrong direction in Jefferson County. So we're getting further behind the national average. Let's go to the other end of life. As a pediatrician, something that I was always very concerned with, and running a Department of Maternal and Child Health in the School of Public Health. And that is infant mortality. There's a complex chart here, a bar chart, but what you see is that of all these countries, and there have to be 20 or 25 of them there, we have the highest rate of infant mortality among all those highly developed countries. And then if we look at the U.S. rate, which is expressed as infant mortality per 1,000 live births, we're at about the U.S. 5.9, but in Alabama we're at 8.5. So that we have a much higher infant mortality rate in Alabama, and that's in a country that already. So our rate, if we compared it to southern states, for instance, and we were to compare that to some countries in Africa, we would even be worse than some of the poorest countries in the world. Now, in neonatology, we've done a terrific job with surfactant, antibiotics, learning how to take care of the nutritional and temperature needs of neonates in reducing infant mortality over the years. So it's really dropped essentially by about 75% or more in the period from when I was a resident in pediatrics in 1970 through the most recent data available. Similarly, Alabama's dropped, but we've always been above the general United States. If we look at black-white differences in infant mortality, we see that Alabama blacks do worse than blacks nationally, and Alabama whites do worse than whites nationally. And there is a big discrepancy, so that whites in Alabama have a rate of about 40% compared to blacks. And that's infant mortality, and we see it at the end of life as well. So going now larger, why are some people healthier than other people? Let's talk about upstream influences in health, not just what we deliver in our offices in terms of medications, diet, activity, smoking cessation, etc. But why are some people healthier than others? Let's look at their patient's place in the population. So we can fixate on a part of the system, the cardiovascular system. I'm a gastroenterologist, so we focus on the gastrointestinal system. But here this group of scientists is looking at the elephant, and one scientist sees it as a snake, the trunk, another person sees the side and the top as a wall, or the leg as a trunk. As a gastroenterologist here in the rear, I might see it as warm and mushy. We deliver a lot of medical care. Many of you are aware that as much as 19% of our gross domestic product is devoted to health care, and you're constantly going to hear about how poor our outcomes are, just like I showed you with infant mortality. And that's true across the board. It's true for longevity, etc., cardiovascular disease rates. What explains these differences? Well, what I'm going to tell you is that socioeconomic factors and the physical environment explain about 50% of the variation in why some people are healthier than others. And then clinical care, what we do in our office, what you're going to go back to doing this afternoon, is responsible for about 20% of the variation. So we can make healthcare access as available as possible. We can lower the cost of medications. We can lower the cost of co-pays. We can, enhance access to our care. But it's still not going to change much of the health outcomes unless we address these upstream determinants. Because we're swimming against a current in our culture. Now, if we look at diabetes, for instance, or diabesity, this combination of diabetes and obesity, we think about obesity rates, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, just like I showed you. And then some of the determinants in terms of diet, activity, and sedentary behavior. For instance, all the time we spend with screens, whether it be Netflix. By the way, I recommend the movie The Joker. It's very good. I saw that last night. I don't make money from that, so this is not a commercial plug, by the way. Then we think about neighborhood deficits. Well, if you don't have healthy choices, you all have healthy choices here on the buffet today. We think about unsafe neighborhoods. We think about blighted neighborhoods, so people are depressed. If you go outside and next to you is a vacant structure collapsing, and empty stores and broken windows, it's not a pleasant environment. Educational opportunities. I just showed you the educational opportunities that children like Tameka and other children in Birmingham School City, in inner city have. Jobs and training. Most of our identity is through our work. People feel ostracized, they feel isolated, they're depressed. People are stressed, they're anxious about finances, they're anxious about their food supply, they're anxious about crime in their neighborhoods and violence. But ultimately, it's us hanging together, which is social cohesion. Who you know. Do you know your neighbors? Do you talk to them? Do you visit with them? Do you get time with your family, or are you too busy? Who do you trust? What are the norms? And we're expected to, be very unusual in a room of physicians and other health providers to see anyone who's a smoker. The norm has switched from when I was much younger and smoked to now almost no one in a healthcare system. And so when you walk into your hospital, it says this is a non-smoking environment. Many of us go back to the days when we remember people smoking in the hallways and the waiting rooms, just about every place other than in the OR. And there's a lot of inequality and poverty and lack of opportunity, and still discrimination. Why don't we fix this problem? We know what the problem is. Does awareness, I'm giving you facts today, I think, and I don't think they're fake facts. Does awareness change our attitude? So you can know a lot of stuff, but does it change our views? And then can we even discuss the problem without fighting? We're so polarized now. It's not just from the 2018 election. We've been polarized and separated for many years. So what happens with awareness? Is there common understanding? No. In fact, we separate. Why do we separate so much? Well, we have a different series of cultural values, which I'll review with you in a moment. So I think the more information hypothesis, that if I give you more information, you're going to change your attitude, and then we're going to do this and do that. That's BS. It doesn't happen. So I don't think that's the answer, just simply providing information. Because what we attribute blame to and responsibilities come from deep cultural values. A lot of these were things we learned as young people. So we can array out, and one theorist has broken us out along this particular grid as to which quadrant you're in. So the horizontal axis is how we view groups. We can be very individualistic. We can say essentially that it's a highly competitive view. We got into professional school, we're established healthcare providers, we're certified, we have licenses, etc. And so we expect other people who don't have that. It's their problem. They have to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And we're not interested in collective assistance. Maybe we'll help somebody else in our family become a pharmacist or a nurse or a PT or a physician or whatever. But we don't care about the larger group. Now, if we have a group way of thinking, and we think more of the community, those are people we interact with frequently in a wide range of activities, be they church, school, Little League baseball, whatever, soccer leagues. That mode of social order promotes values of solidarity. So we see the larger community. And we're more solidarity oriented rather than just purely competitive. The other grid, the vertical grid here, is sort of how we view other people. Do we put them all in classes so that, in the healthcare setting, the doctor is above the nurse, over the PT, over the dietitian, over the OT? Or how do we do it, or do we really have a team? Well, that's true also of the larger community. Do we want this hierarchy, and are we set on maintaining that hierarchy and our own group protection? Or are we more egalitarian and work well with other people who don't have some of the same opportunities that we've had? So even peeps separate. As we come up on Easter this year, so you have sort of the purple peeps saying, like, oh my gosh, did you hear about the oranges? And there were oranges saying, those blue and purple peeps are wannabes. And then finally, the blue peeps are saying, look at these purple and orange peeps. They're so ugly. Yeah, they're so weird. So we have our own groups that we hang with. So we're all sort of peeps of different sorts. So what we need, how do we communicate this message? Well, first of all, we have to know what the general public believes. The general public believes that individuals are primarily responsible for their health. So we want to blame somebody if they're unhealthy. We think that medical care is a main determinant of their health. And yet we recognize the role that some socioeconomic determinants play. We have also, but we have to acknowledge what I would call the big but. And I'm not talking about what we're sitting on. I'm talking about the fact that we can acknowledge the role of individual decisions. We all made individual decisions to be a smoker or a non-smoker, eat healthy, go home and exercise today, or whatever. But we have to refute the idea that individual behavior and medical care alone are responsible for poor health. We have to emphasize that unemployment, discrimination, poverty all affect and shape individual behaviors. And that medical care, and those all constrain the choices that we have. If we constrain the choices, then people will eat badly. If you're in an unsafe neighborhood and you can't walk outside, well, then you're not going to go and walk outside. Same with unhealthy eating. So how do we communicate this? Well, I think the one American value that just about everybody would agree with is that people need a fair chance for good health. Not everybody's going to end up in the same place or just as healthy, but they need a fair chance for good health. We need to give people opportunities for better health choices. I mean, you have a buffet there. You can choose what you want, whether you had the fried food or the broiled food. Enable people to choose the right path. So we're not going to force people, we just make it easy, and we give them the tools for better decisions. We don't, if you want to, polarize people, you talk about how immoral their position is, express a lot of outrage, injustice, etc. That does not communicate, does not have anybody have genuine concerns about some of these issues. Let's talk about the business case. It comes down to dollars and cents, which is what we think about a lot in healthcare. If we were to close that educational gap that I showed you, we will actually have 2.3 trillion, that's 2,300 billions, or 2.3 millions, in terms of the increase in the U.S. economy by 2050. For every dollar we spend in preschool education, pre-K education, you get a $13 return on that investment. You should do so well in your investments. And so we're doing more pre-K throughout the state, so that by about the next 3 or 4 years, almost every child in Alabama will have access to pre-K. What about if everybody has the same opportunity for good health? We would save $135 billion annually. $42 billion from more productivity. In other words, every time a patient is disabled and they're unemployed or they go on disability, we lose productivity. And then excess health care costs an extra $93 billion. So there's a strong case, business case, plain old dollars and cents, for changing the way we do things. So what are some potential strategies? And I don't have time to define all these, but essentially it's education, pre-K for all. Kids who are failing, whether we see them in 3rd grade, 4th grade, 8th grade, 11th grade, do tutoring and after-school sessions for the kids falling behind. That would be mandatory. We want to improve school engagement. I mean, many of us were engaged in school. We got rewards, recognition, etc. So we want more children and families engaged with school. And then we need community programs to improve the physical, social, and family environments. Now, it'd be normal to avoid some of my suggestions here, so this might be the response to the suggestions. I'm going to finish with a little fable, a little story. So, a hungry lion came upon a herd of cattle. He chased and he caught the bull. He ate till full and let out with a great roar. A nearby hunter heard the lion and shot him. So I'm looking for somebody to tell me the moral of the story. I have a little dollar I'll give you if you can tell me the moral of the story. So, any volunteers?
You should not be hungry.
Well, that's probably true, particularly with all this good food here. Chandler, you shouldn't be hungry, man. But I see the moral as when you are full of bull, you should keep your mouth shut. So today we've gone through with this BS meter from putting on your boot stage to putting on the life vest to manning the lifeboats. And finally, this is not pedophilia, this is just a pediatrician's view of the end of the talk. So I love the hard questions, but I certainly prefer the easy ones. So I think we have some time for questions. So, questions, comments, thoughts, suggestions? There have to be some. Sounds like we got an organ in the background.
Do you think it would be any good to mix all the people together?
I do.
But then that would just bring all the stores down.
No, I don't think it would necessarily do that. I think that it depends on the ratio that you mix. There was a program actually done in Chicago and in several other cities a number of years ago called Moving to Opportunity, where they essentially took individuals in the Section 8 housing, public housing, and they gave them the opportunity to move into wealthier districts, or they just assigned them to similar kinds of projects. And what they showed is that moving to better neighborhoods decreased obesity and improved a number of health outcomes. It was a little varied between the child's age, the younger you move, and the females were more susceptible to the impact of living in a better neighborhood than the males were. But I think it would. I am a proponent of mixed income housing. Some of it is downtown. Some of you are familiar that they knocked down Metropolitan Gardens, a public housing project downtown, put in Park Place right near downtown. It's a mixed income housing development, and people seem to be doing quite well there. We have one out in Tuxedo Park in Inslee as well. So yes, I think if we don't know other people and if we don't know their experiences, no different than talking to people in clinic. You know, you have to know that patient's experience. So if you don't talk to other people and you don't find out that they share the same concerns that we do, they're concerned about their family, they're concerned about their children doing better than they did, and they're concerned about Alabama football, you know, or Auburn football. We all have the same interests. We just don't talk to people enough to find out that they share those same kinds of interests. So yeah, I think personally, mixed income housing seems to be proven. But it depends on the ratio in which you mix people together. Probably in the range of 20 or 30% mix of poor people with people better off is probably a good mix.
What was the outcome of the busing children from one place to the other, and why did they stop?
Well, I think there was a lot of, you know, I'm not a student of that, so I don't know. My impression is that busing worked in some areas and didn't work in others. I think there was a lot of resistance because, you know, our concept of a neighborhood school is very strong. You know, a number of us were able to walk to school when we were growing up. So I think that, yeah, people want their own neighborhoods. So I think the busing thing, the other thing is the busing came down from the feds. And programs that come down from on top and are not generated from the community just aren't accepted. I don't think anybody wants to feel that they're manipulated by the federal government. So that's, I think, one of the challenges. Well, what's your impression, Jenna? What do you think? You've been around a little bit longer than I have.
Talking to me?
Mm.
I think the problem is with the individual who lives in the community, because there were a lot of poor communities all through the existence of the United States that were clean, nobody was killing each other.
Yeah.
No one was burning down buildings or breaking windows. It comes down to the individual person and how they behave.
I think it is the individual person, but what we do in a neighborhood, just like you all would be surprised if I threw this cup on the floor as I was leaving, rather than bring it to a trash can over here or whatever, because we don't do that. So it's the norms of what other people do. So when you have a destroyed neighborhood and your houses are, you know, falling apart and the one next to you is vacant and there are people hanging out there who are pretty unsavory, I think then you get into that mindset. So I think the norms have changed over the years. I mean, there's no doubt that single motherhood is an issue. That's changed dramatically over the years. I think the role of the church has changed. I think that is a factor as well. So I think there are larger social influences. I mean, ultimately the individual does it, but the question is, why do we do what we do? And that's because of what we're expected to do. You know, we're expected to come to CME meetings. We're expected to respect our fellow colleagues in a clinical setting. We do that because that's the expectation. There are places where that isn't the expectation, and people don't do it. So I think it is, you know, I agree with you about the individual, but who we are as an individual is largely determined by our peers. Other questions, comments? All right, well then, thank you very much.